Hi everybody, so hopefully you found video number 1 useful and helpful. Now in this video, the second video of this 4-part series, we're going to talk about the 2 main stages of the drawing. And specifically we're going to focus on the first part, which I call the block-in. Some people call it an outline or the contour or whatever, right? The line, it's basically the line drawing, the framework with which your drawing hangs together. Most people, not all artists, but most people, when they do something that's representational, so it doesn't have to be photorealistic, but when they do something that's at least somewhat realistic, they tend to work in this way. Okay, now I know some of you are probably thinking, well, there's lots of different stages to a drawing. There's, you know, the outline, there's the beginning of the rendering, there's putting in contrast and highlights and shadows, and yeah, you could break down a drawing into probably dozens and dozens of different sections, but for the purpose of explanation, I like to break it into 2. Okay, so the block-in is everything from the bare paper to a point where you have a framework. You don't put in any shadows. I mean, you may indicate lines with shadows. You'll see when I start doing some of my block-ins that I actually use shadow lines and highlight lines to help me map out the face, okay? But you don't actually begin putting it in any real rendering, okay? And then everything else in the drawing is the rendering stage. And within the rendering stage, as I said, there's lots of different segments, right? There's adding details and adding contrast and what have you. We're not going to worry about that too much. That's going to be in the later videos. But for now, I want to talk in this video mostly about the block-in stage. Okay. The best analogy I can give about breaking a drawing into 2 parts like this is building a house. Okay. If you've ever watched a house being built, maybe one's built on a house on the way to your office every day or something like that. And it's quite a feat to see because quite often there will be a hole in the ground, and within 3 or 4 weeks there's what looks like a complete house, right? There will be the foundation, the framing, the joists, the subfloors, the sheathing, and even the roof, okay? And it's gone up very, very quickly. But before people can move in, there's so much work that has to be done. If you think about the block-in, it's like that initial stage, right? It's like the framing and the roofing and the foundation of a house, okay? When you walk into a house, if you're going to purchase a house, you don't worry about the foundation and the framing and everything else. You look at, you know, what's the layout like? Does the kitchen have granite countertops? How big are the bedrooms? That sort of thing, okay? That's what makes us buy a house. And that's quite often what makes someone like a portrait. They'll look at the rendering and the rendering portion and they'll say, oh, it's so beautifully done, or the eyes are so emotive, or, you know, there's such accuracy in this. But that's because we've taken for granted that the block-in stage is right, okay? Now let's go back to that house analogy. Let's imagine that you're ready to buy this house. You've put in an offer, they've accepted it, now you've got a home inspection, okay? If the home inspector comes back to you and he says, house is good, but the foundation is falling apart, that's probably a deal breaker, right? Whereas if you walked into a house and you said, I love everything about this, it's fantastic, but I hate the color in the bedroom on the closet door, that's not a deal breaker. Right? And so if we go back to the block-in, think of the block-in of your drawing as the foundation and the framework of your house, okay? We don't think about it after we look at a drawing. We don't consider it as long as it's right. But if there's even the tiniest bit that's wrong, if the floors are totally off kilter and the walls are crooked, you may not buy that house. And it's the same with the drawing. If you don't get that block-in right, it probably isn't going to be a successful drawing. And in the same way that the house, the framing and the shell of the house is often only a very, 4 weeks, maybe 3 weeks even, but the house itself might take 6 months to build. It's the same with the drawing. And so artists often say, well, I can skip over the block-in, and they take shortcuts. Most notably is things like tracing or using a projector or what have you. I'm going to talk about that a little bit when we get back to the drawing board. But just bear in mind that if you do those shortcuts, down the road, that could be a problem, okay? So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give that little bit of analogy. Now we're going to go to the board. I'm going to go through some things. I'm going to do a sample block in and show you some of the methods that you can use to create your block in, which, as I said, is really important of your drawing. Okay, I'll see you on the flip side. Now we're back at the board, and I wanted to talk to you about the various methods for getting a block in, getting your line drawing on the paper. Okay, now in my book, which is available in stores if it's something that you're interested in, I talk about the various methods of doing block in. Now, I'm not going to do a demo in each and every one of them, partially because I don't really do them very much, but also because we're limited in time, and I'd like to just focus on the ones that we're going to be doing. Okay, so one of the most common ones is the grid method. Now, in a nutshell, you take your photo reference, you grid it up. Okay, so you could either draw, if you printed out your reference, you could either draw grid, or if you did it on a computer or on a tablet or a phone or something, you can put a digital grid on. And then on your paper, you also draw grids. Now, the nice thing about the grid method is that you can, if you have a photo this small and you grid it, as long as you have proportional squares on your piece of paper that you're working on, you can make it any size you want. The downside is that you end up with lines on your paper, which is kind of a nuisance. But, you know, you start to draw, basically you draw what happens in each and every square. So you break, what it really does is instead of having to draw the whole thing, you break it down into smaller sections, right? And as you go, you erase the grid until you have something that's a little bit more accurate, right? It helps with accuracy. Tracing is another thing. So the tracing would be using transfer paper, would be using a light box, it would be using a projector. It's a method. It works. Some people like it. A lot of professional illustrators and people that are on tight deadlines will use tracing. Some of the greats that from the past have used tracing. It's not a problem in itself. The problem with tracing is that you end up becoming really beholden to it, right? If all you ever do is trace, it's difficult to build skills. Okay, so I'm not judging anyone. If you want to trace, that's up to you. But I hope that you at least try to work from life and try to work freehand, etc. Now, freehand is the ultimate goal, I think. The reason that it's the ultimate goal is it's the method that allows you to work under any circumstances, right? You can work from a photograph, you can work from real life, you can work quickly, you can work whatever, right? And I'm not going to get into the details of this. I will do a block in freehand next, but it is something that takes a lot of practice. There's no question about it. And, you know, I used to just explain these three methods. There are others. There's certainly things like the Maas Method and what have you, where you break down your shape into certain shapes. You know, you draw a circle and then you draw a square. And the problem with any of those is you tend to end up, your work tends to look like the person whose method it's based on. And that may or may not be an issue. But the three main ones are the ones that I've explained. So the grid, the tracing, and the freehand. And when I used to do demos and teach and that, I would always kind of push people towards freehand. The problem is that there's a big jump in skill necessary in order to be effective at it. And that became quite difficult for people, and it became sort of discouraging for people. So I developed something called the Maas Method, and it's explained in this book here. It's essentially the same idea as what's called sight size. So when an artist draws from life and they create something that's sight size, what they do, and you can kind of see it in this picture here, is you start off by making lines where the top and the bottom of the head would be. And then once you have that, you move your easel so that you're in relation to the subject. And once your reference and your subject are the same size, then you use the grid, like the marking lines of, horizontal lines, like the line where their eyes would be, the line where their nose would be, the line, whatever. And you use that to create a portrait that is exactly the same size as the reference in relation to you. Okay, sounds complicated, but it's really not. The Maas method is doing that, but on paper with a photo reference. Okay, I'm going to show you in a minute how I do the Maas method. Okay, first I'm going to do a freehand sketch, and then I'm going to show you the Maas method, and hopefully between those two you'll get a better understanding of what the sort of the goal is, and along the way you can start developing some of these skills which maybe you can't with something like tracing, or even the grid method. The grid method is if you become reliant on the grid method, the problem is if you're drawing from life, you need to bring your own grid or something, a mesh to put in front of the model, which certainly has happened. I mean, there's lots of artists in the past that have done that. But if you can get to the point where you're doing freehand or even something like the Maas method, then you'll find that you're building those skills that can be applied to other things. Okay, so let's go do a freehand now. And then after that, I'm going to do the Maas method, okay? Okay, now I want to do a sample block, and again, I'm working on the 300 series Bristol, okay? And we're going to do actually a drawing of this young lady, Lauren. Okay, I'm going to start off with, so we're going to do this just in graphite. I'm just gathering my pencils here. I'm going to use a B, that's a B, an HB, a 4B, and an 8B. So those 4 pencils is what we're going to use, okay? And these are graphite and water-soluble graphite. Okay, so we're going to start off with the HB. Okay. And the first thing I'm doing before my pencils even touch the paper is kind of getting a sense of where I want the head. Okay, so and the reason that I'm doing that is I want to know that it will all fit on the page. I want it to be this size so that I can still look at my reference here. So normally I wouldn't have my reference right there. A lot of times I work from a monitor, which I have next to my board, or I would put it off to the side. But obviously for the sake of the demo here, I am going to have it all on one page. Okay, so I'm less worried about, not super worried about her features yet. I'm more worried about the overall shape. Okay, one of the things that people ask me a lot is, what do you call your style? I don't really call it anything, or what is your method? It's just working from general to specific. Okay. So very, very rough lines, simple lines to get an idea. You may notice that some of the lines are starting to get darker. So I'm starting to add a bit more pressure, because that means that I'm starting to lock in lines. Okay, so now you can see I've got kind of this overall shape of her head. I have in my head measured out the different relationships, but you can do that with a ruler or your finger or a piece of paper or a pencil or whatever. Okay, I'm going to switch to a B now, which is a slightly darker pencil, just because I want to, at some point, sometimes when you put down too many lines, it can be difficult to see what the heck you're doing. So I want to now get into the more not permanent lines, but the more sort of locked in lines, right? So I know that they're in the right place and what have you. Okay, so I'm starting to see her face kind of take shape. Now, one of the things that I talk about, it's all about measuring, right? Shapes to shapes, like this shape versus this shape, and sizes and that have you. But one thing that people often, like, they'd look at a reference like this and they'd say, okay, the nose is this size and the eyes are this size, and here's the relationship. But they miss things like this shadow, okay? And this shadow is a shape in itself. So if I have her hair coming in like this shadow is also a part of it, okay? And I might, even though I haven't really indicated the eyes, I might just really, really lightly throw in this. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that I remember that this line is the shadow line. Because sometimes when you look back, you go, well, wait a minute, what am I doing there? Especially I find that when I'm drawing teeth, I will indicate certain teeth and then I'll go back and I'll say, wait a minute, which tooth is that? Right? So hopefully that makes some sense. Now we're gonna try and hone in a little bit more on her face. Now this reference is, I like it because it's kind of a neat shot. I like her expression, but it is a little hard to see what's going on there, especially with her nose. There's a shape in there. So I'm not locking in all of these lines just yet because I might change my mind. You can absolutely positively erase things if you want to. But I find that it's better for the energy of the drawing, if at all possible, not to erase. So I try to, rather than erase, I try to just work light enough that if a line doesn't work, then I can switch it to, I can just sort of go over it and it just gives it more volume. It doesn't necessarily affect the sorry, when I'm drawing sometimes you think that you'd be able to talk at the same time, but different parts of the brain take over. So yeah, well, once I lock in a line, then I know it's in the right place. If I work lightly and I don't lock in the line, then that's okay too, because a line that is wrong, as long as it's light enough, won't actually interfere with the finished drawing, as long as I've locked in the lines that do, if that makes sense. Okay. So now we're just sort of focusing on those eyeballs a little. And those underlying shapes in the face are important. So like you can see here, there's sort of a shadow here. Sometimes in photos, it's hard to determine what you're actually looking at. I always recommend drawing from life at least a couple of hours a week if you can. The reason being that when you do work from photos, you start to understand what you're looking at more because you're more familiar with those shapes. So even though you may not have drawn that specific pose from life, you get a better sense of what's actually happening there, if that makes sense. In the bridge of her nose, there's some shapes I need to adjust. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to having an effective block-in. There's certainly some areas that need a bit more work. There's some areas that I probably need to fix. But for the sake of the demo, I'm going to switch to a 4B now. Okay. And just to give it, so if we go back to that analogy that I talked about earlier in about building a house, right? Go back to that analogy. Right now, what we're looking at, sorry, I'm noticing that there's something not quite right there. I'm just going to come in with an eraser, actually. This part just right here, I think. I want to just redraw that part right there. That's important because it's right around her eye. So that's obviously quite a key section of the face. Okay, and you notice I'm still using the 4B. I didn't switch because it's dark enough. I just vary my pressure, right? So just make sure it's not too dark. And it should be okay. Okay. So yeah, if we go back to the analogy of building a house, at this stage we've kind of got the foundation and the framing in. And by bringing in these slightly darker areas and maybe adding in a few shadows here and there without getting too far into the rendering stage, it would be akin to adding the floor joists and the sheathing and that kind of thing, right? So okay, and then we'll just, because this is just a demo I'm blocking in, I don't want to spend too much time. I'm not going to do a full rendering of this. This is just to show you how you freehand a block in. And I might just add in a bit of darks for and there's still, you know, certain things that could be fixed as far as adding a little bit more dimension to it, but it's enough to kind of have a starting point, right? Shows her shirt there. And then we still have that shadow, right? Which is thrown. This part of her face is in shadow. The bridge of her nose. There's some shadow going on down here. You get it. But anyway, so there's a very basic block in a fairly short period of time. Okay, so I'm going to try now to explain to you the Maas method. Okay, this is something that I've taught students and demos and that a number of times, but to try and do it in video is a little bit more difficult, but let's see if we can figure it out. So I've taken a photograph and I've printed it off, okay, and I've actually printed it twice. You can see it up here. It's off the page just because we're limited. I want you to be able to see where I'm drawing here, okay. The drawback, the big drawback of the Maas method, and the same with site size, is that you end up with, your picture is going to be the exact same size as your reference. Okay, that's how you're measuring. It's the same drawback you have with site size, that when you work with site size, you need to move closer or further from the subject so that it is the same size. Okay, but so what we're going to do basically is we're going to use this and this one up here. You could get away with one and just move it eventually, but it's nice to be able to tape them in place and be able to use them all the time while you're doing the drawing. But we're going to use these to create a drawing here. Okay, you certainly don't have to tape it to your paper. If you wanted to, you could, you know, if I was going to actually do this, I would probably turn the paper and tape them around. But for the sake of a video that needs to be horizontal, this seemed to make the most sense, okay? So we're going to start off by, I'm using an HB pencil, so relatively light. We're going to start off by mapping out some of the key points in the reference, okay? So that is the dead center line of her two eyeballs, okay? And very lightly I've created a line over here. This is the bottom of her nose, okay? Now I should probably go up here, and that's why it's nice to be able to do it that way. I should probably go up here and create like a center point. Okay, so this right here is like the center of her nose, and that's the bottom of her nose. Okay. This would be the corner of her mouth. Okay, and chin to chin. Okay, and then I can come over here and I can find the side of her head and side of her head. Okay, and we can go as detailed as you want. So we can say, okay, corner of eyes, and I'm just gonna eyeball this just because, as you saw in the last video, I am fairly comfortable freehanding. So I can see, without using a ruler, I can see where these points of reference really are, okay? But you can see how you could honestly map out every little thing. Like if you wanted to map out that highlight, it goes right there, right? And if you wanted to map out, you know, the top of the highlight, it goes right here. Okay, it takes some practice. You're not going to sit down and figure it out right away. But now that I've got these kind of key sort of points of reference in place, I can map out the face much more effectively. Okay, and as I said, so for me, as someone that can do a block in fairly, that's the top of the eyebrow, it's the bottom of the eyebrow, it's the edge, just trying to figure this out. For me that can do a freehand drawing fairly effectively, this method is not necessarily, it's not that it's not useful, it's not that it's not worthwhile, it's just it's not necessary, right? Because I don't need it. But if you're struggling with getting proportions right, this is a really nice sort of way of doing that, right? Because it allows you to see where everything's supposed to go. Now my center point right there, and I come over here, and it just gives you that little bit of extra, you know. I could guess, like if I do the top ones, I could, top of her lip goes like that. Okay, so I just freehanded that, or I could actually look and I could say, so that's kind of the corner of her lip. The other corner we've got right here. Okay, it just gives you that little extra sort of help that you may need, right? Depending upon where you are in terms of your experience level and what have you, right? Okay, and again, like, so with the nostrils, if we want to, we can actually mark where those nostrils are. Now, you know, it's like anything else. So I can kind of see where that's supposed to be, But if you wanted to, you could make a whole line, and then you could go up here and say, okay, this is the edge of the nostril, and this is the edge of the other nostril. And it does sort of take some of the spontaneity out of the drawing. There's no question about that. But you know, you're not going to learn overnight how to freehand something effectively. That's just not the way it works, right? It's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of practice. And with something like this, the Maas method, it allows you to it's not a quick fix, because there is still a lot of work involved, and it does take a lot of time to sort of figure out how everything goes. Sorry, I cheated because I could anticipate where that was supposed to be, but I'm trying to do this for you guys, so I'll try to be more accurate. That's like the top, and that's the other eyelid, and I already mapped this out, so it will take you time, right? There's no question about that it takes time to learn it. And you know, when we learn a difficult skill, and honestly, in my opinion, learning to draw accurately, especially a face accurately, is probably one of the most difficult skills there is for an artist. Sometimes we need all the help we can get in terms of learning that skill. Okay. So again, I can, and you know, you don't have to use a ruler. You can kind of eyeball things if you want to. That's entirely up to you and what your own skill level is like. I find that once you have broken things down, like so we've got kind of everything in where we expect them, then you don't maybe need to map out every little thing. Like you probably don't have to map out the actual details in the eyeball. But that's why they're there, right? I've taped these references here, so if I want to, I can. The other really nice thing is that it allows you to fix things, right? So if you go back in and you say, why does her nose look like it's in the wrong place? Now you can go back and look and try and figure out what is causing that, what is the problem, and how do we fix it, okay? So at this point, it's still very light, right? I am working with, as I said, an HB pencil. So this is quite a soft drawing at this point. I'm not going to probably go into the full rendering with this one. Maybe at some point I will. But for this demo, you know, we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of limited in time because I have a lot of ground to cover. But I will get it to the point where it's at least the main block in is done. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to map out every little thing. I think that I've explained to you kind of how the Maas method works now. So now I don't mind just freehanding a few things by eye. Okay, her shirt comes around like that. Okay, so let's see if we can't just add in a little bit of dark now. So I'm going to switch to a 4B. Okay. Just a little pencil sharpener there, if you're wondering what that noise was. And I said, without spending a ton of time on this, we're just going to refine some of these areas. Okay, and I think you can see how using the Maas method can certainly make things a little bit simpler on you, right? I think I went a little bit high on that nostril. So I talk about this a lot when I work with students, but the problem with drawing a portrait is that we're so used, it's ingrained in our brains that we immediately recognize people, and we're so used to just the slightest nuances. When you walk down the street, you see your friend from a block away, even though you may not be able to see their face, or she may be wearing sunglasses, or he may be got a haircut, but you can still recognize them right away because we've just been like, it's just in our DNA that we recognize things. So when we look at a drawing, if it's not perfect, we notice it immediately. And so with the portrait, you have to be very careful. Now, you'll notice that I want to talk about one other thing here while I'm doing this. You'll notice that I varied my lines there, right? There's a really dark line here, and then it gets soft, and then it darkens up in certain places. That's comes back to the idea of line quality, okay? And that's something that I will try and discuss a little bit in one of the later videos when we're doing full rendering. If you bang away at a drawing using the same quality of line, so the same thickness, the same intensity, and the same sort of basically the same line, right? You'll find that your drawings end up being a little bit boring. If you have kids or have been around kids and you've seen their coloring books are often fairly accurate in how they're drawn, but generally pretty boring because the line quality in them is atrocious. Every line is the same thickness. Now that's intentional. It's not that they're bad artists. It's that it's easier to color if every line is the same sort of thickness. But as artists, we want to vary our thickness because it makes the drawing more interesting. So you can see here where the lips, there's shadow in that corner, so that gets dark. And then where it comes together, in some cases, the upper and bottom lip almost work together, right? There is, of course, a separation. If she was to just suddenly open up her mouth, you would see a big separation. But in the drawing, we don't necessarily see that because when we look at her from a distance, we're not up close to her mouth. So when we look at her from a distance, we just see the two lips sort of blending together as one thing, right? As I said, I'll try, even though the other ones are going to be time lapses, they're going to be very fast. I will do a voiceover because we have to cover a 3-hour drawing in a 30-minute video or what have you. So I'll do a full voiceover explaining everything, and I'll try and explain things like line quality and that sort of thing. So I think that's probably, at this stage, if I was to go much further, I wouldn't really call it blocking anymore, right? Because now we're kind of in the stage, you even see that I'm starting to add a little bit of dark. I'm starting to add a little bit of shadow and light and what have you. But when I look at it, I think, okay, it's pretty accurate. If I was going to start rendering now, like let's say that I wanted to turn this into a really finished drawing, I feel like I've got a pretty good foundation. When I look at the two, they look pretty accurate. I believe that I have all of the areas that I want mapped out. If I didn't, I certainly could go back in and make adjustments. Like if I didn't feel confident about where some of these lines were. I could then, I could grab my ruler again, and I could decide how different things come together. But I think for the purpose of this demo, I think it kind of explains everything that I want to explain. So hopefully this makes sense to you. It's, as I said, conceptually it's not that difficult. I think once you've done it a couple of times, it's not that difficult either. I'm probably making it look a little bit easier than it is. I'm telling you that right now. I'm just being honest. But I think that as you start to use it, if you find that it's something that you want to attempt more, you should find that it will get easier as you do it more, and you'll become more proficient at it. And if it is a method that you find yourself wanting to use, wanting to try, and what have you, I'd love to hear about whether you tried to apply it into life drawing, or drawing something from life using the sight size method, because as I said, it really works quite well too. So anyway, so that's about it for now. Sorry. I'm really bad for saying, okay, I'm done a drawing now, and then continuing to work on it. Even though this is probably never going anywhere, I'd probably never even show it to anybody. Even Chelsea, the model, probably won't ever see this. I've drawn her a ton of times, so it's not like it's any new thing for her. But I still, once I look at something, I'm like, oh, gotta fix that. Oh, gotta fix that. So it's an artist's curse, right? We are always looking at things. And anyway, so hopefully that's helpful and useful to you. And that about wraps it up for this video. I want to do just one more section in video number 2 here, and that is on choosing your reference. But I'm going to switch to some photographs of some models in that, and we'll do that right about now. Okay. Okay, and so the last part of this video, I want to talk about choosing your subjects. Okay. And also choosing the reference for your subject. So I did this painting of a friend, Tova, in pastel. Choosing who to draw should be as simple as really who you want to draw. It really, we do this for ourselves more than anything else. Even if you're a professional artist and you work on commissions and what have you, you're still ultimately doing it for yourself, right? If you never made another dime doing paintings or drawings, you never sold another piece of artwork, you'd still probably continue to do it. So because of that, you should be drawing what you want. And if you've got friends or family, if we're talking about drawing portraits, then you should have models at your availability, right? So the who or the what is really a personal thing. And I think that, don't be shy. Ask a friend if they'll model for you. If you're working from photos, which most of us do, because working from life can be a real difficult task to ask someone to sit for you for a long time. It's as simple as taking a half a dozen photos. So time constraint is really an important thing. But let's assume that we've got the subject and we know who we want to draw. How do we decide what image to draw? And so when I did this painting, I actually worked from a number of different images, and I want to just tell you or show you some of the photos that I worked from. So I blew them up large just so that they could be easy to understand. So this was one of the first photos in, there was probably 100 photos that I took in the shoot. And the thing about this photo, when I looked at it, there wasn't a lot of visual interest going on. I wasn't really drawn to drawing this exact image. But what I really liked was how she was only part of the drawing, or part of the composition, right? And so you can see here, she's only not even half of the composition. The rest of it is all very sort of subtle landscape. So that's kind of what I got from this image. From this one, there was just certain elements. So sometimes I'll look at photos and there'll just be tiny little things that are important to me. And in this one, it was these sharp edges. So just those tiny little sharp edges which I ended up, as you can see, using here. Okay, so these were things as I was working on it, I was like, okay, I don't want to use this one. It's not going to be my main base, but there are elements that I like. So that's how that one came in. This one is quite similar in terms of the actual pose. This was all about what is she thinking, and that really became the theme of the whole painting. So this one probably is the closest thing to the actual main reference that I use for this. Obviously it's flipped, but it set the tone for the feel of the painting. Okay, and that was really why this one to me was an important reference shot. This one, a lot of times when we look at reference, what we see is what we don't want to use, and that's what this one was. Here she's actually looking at the viewer. I didn't want that. I knew that I didn't want that, and this photograph sort of confirmed it for me. I did like her hair. I like the way that the sun hit it, and you'll see that is something that I kind of incorporated in there. I used this as my reference more than the last one, but I realized that I want her looking up. I wanted her to be in this sort of thoughtful sort of pose. Okay, and then finally, this one, it seems like there's not a lot going on there, but you can see that there's these little wisps of hair that kind of go all over the place. This became the real key point of this painting, which, as you can see, I really exaggerated the wisps. The title of this painting is Shelter from the Storm, after the great Bob Dylan song, and it was really to give more of a feel of what's going on in the area, not so much a portrait of an individual person, although it certainly speaks to Tova herself. But so that gives you a little bit of an insight into how I create an image. A lot of times when I work on a painting or a drawing, I use multiple images. In videos 3 and 4, I'm going to do complete demos from start to finish using just one image. That's simply because it's easier for me to explain to you what I'm doing if I'm only working off of one. But a lot of my more finished pieces, I use elements from lots of different images. Okay, so hopefully that helps you understand a little bit what the thinking is behind my choices and my thought process. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for video number 2. We're now going to head over. I'm going to do a demo on toned tan paper, the toned tan sketch, using just monochromatic color scheme. Okay, so I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.